press the recording button now, and the recording can be shared externally upon request. So as many of you know, the oil and gas sector accounts for around 1/3 of the man-made methane emissions, a highly potent greenhouse gas. Within this sector, however, there are huge opportunities to cut these emissions. The International Energy Agency estimates that emissions can be reduced by over 75% by implementing well-known measures such as leak detection and repair or replacing leaky equipment. But how much does it cost to abate methane emissions in the oil and gas sector? Over the past couple of years, efforts have been made to establish the marginal abatement cost of methane emissions. Some economists have tried to use econometrics methodology to derive the marginal abatement cost curve in the US natural gas production sector, for example. Many of you might be familiar with the IEA's MAC curve, which they update every year with their global methane tracker. So today we will be looking at one of the recent efforts, specifically Dr. Vignesh Adiappan, Associate Professor at the Swinburne University of Technology in Sarawak campus, will tell us more about his team's work to develop marginal abatement cost analysis for potential emission abatement technology in the oil and gas sector in Malaysia. So now without further ado, Dr. Vignesh, the floor is yours.
All right, so thanks, Huang, for the introduction, and thanks to the EDF team for organizing this event, as well as inviting me to just share our perspective from the Malaysian angle. Let me just start by sharing my screen here. Right. Okay. Right, just let me know if you can see my full screen.
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so thanks again, everybody. I understand that we have a lot of audience members from different parts of the world, but thank you for accommodating the Asian time zone in this series. All right, it's about 4 p.m. in Malaysian time, so right after this will be time for me to leave my office to go back home. So, you know, we're saving the best for last, I would say. All right, so I'm going to be sharing a perspective on methane emissions in oil and gas, particularly in Malaysia. All right, looking at what our efforts have been, what are the current efforts ongoing here in Malaysia, particularly our project teams work on developing the marginal abatement cost curve for the Malaysian oil and for the oil and gas sector in Malaysia. So this is myself representing the project team, and then I have a co-investigator, which is Dr. Hao over here. We are both from the chemical engineering department here at Swinburne University. And we also have our postdoctoral researcher, Dr. Jaya Prashant, who's also here in the audience with us. And also our research assistant, Ms. Adeline here, who's our PhD student now at Swinburne University of Technology, right? So just a little bit of introduction to the institute, where we are from, just to give a bit of context. So I think some of you may or may not have heard of Swinburne. So Swinburne University of Technology is based in Melbourne in Australia. It was established in 1908 in the Melbourne campus in Hawthorne. And of course, in the year 2000, the Sarawak campus opened, but it was an institute of technology at that point of time. But then later in the year of 2004 is where the institute in Sarawak gained its university status. And what's interesting about the university's business model is that it is a partnership between the Sarawak state government. Sarawak is particularly the state that is in Malaysia, on the east side of Malaysia. And it's a partnership with the state government and Swinburne University in Melbourne. Yeah, so myself and my team, we are based in the Sarawak campus that is on the east side of Malaysia. Yeah. All right, so let me just give a bit of a background. I understand that Huang just now mentioned about IEA and you know, their efforts of updating MAC curves from time to time, but just taking a little bit of one of their work, looking at net zero roadmaps for 2050 for the energy sector. One of the things they mentioned was, you know, methane is an important emission component that needs to be looked at, particularly because it's 80 times higher in global warming potential compared to other emissions. And at the same time, in one of the installments of the COP series in COP26, mandates the 30% methane reductions by 2030. So this is one of the key targets to look at. So 2030 is really not that far away from where we are right now. We are already in halfway through 2024, and we really need to look at our strategies in terms of methane emissions reduction. And one thing is that from the reports, at least at that point in time, it was pointed out that the oil and gas sector or the industry is responsible for about 25%. I presume this is already going to be updated. This number should be different by this stage, all right? But then it's 25% of the global anthropogenic methane emissions in this case. So we can see that 25% is quite a large number, and it is a reasonable number for us to give focus and attention in terms of our efforts. And that is the international landscape. Now going on to the Malaysian landscape where we are located at, one of our major oil and gas operators, of course, is Petronas, the national oil company. And Petronas, I think about a year and a half ago, if I remember correctly, they were one of the signatory members of the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. This is the OGMP 2.0. And this was their, in a way, a signal of their commitment towards reporting and mitigating methane emissions. So on the backdrop of that, it's a very timely moment for us to look into methane abatement, cost abatement curves, and so on. Yeah, but of course, that is a good starting point. But then the question now remains: how much would it cost the Malaysian oil and gas sector to abate particularly its methane emissions in this case? So that is where we come in. For our project team, we look at how we can answer this question. And just to give you some context on the oil and gas activity in Malaysia, so we are broken down into the west side and the east side of Malaysia. So of course, for those of you who have not been to Malaysia, Malaysia is not one plot of land, there's two. There's one on the west side, and then the South China Sea is a big portion in between that separates the west and the east side. So we are somewhere down here right now in Kuching, in Sarawak. And like most of us, like I think Prashant, our postdoc over here, he's in West Malaysia actually right now, while the three of us in our project team are situated in Kuching here. All right, and just to give you some context about the oil and gas activity in Malaysia. So this is from 2022 reports, the published reports that are accessible in Malaysia. So the oil and gas production in Malaysia, so we have about 660,000 barrels per day of oil production, and we have a natural gas about approximately 7 billion cubic feet per day. So this is of course from 2022. We are midway through 2024. We're waiting for the updated numbers on this, but you can access this information from the Malaysia Petroleum Management directory. So this is the data that we're using to give the context of where we are at in terms of production, just to give you some idea. And what our goal was to look at, how we can determine what would be the cost of abatement in Malaysia. But before we could do that, we had to narrow down our scope, because this is a project that is for a duration of 1 year. And we can only do so much in 1 year. So we have to sort of, ideally you would think that we would like to look at the entire oil and gas sector and do the abatement analysis for the entire sector. But when you confine it to just 1 year, we only can do so much. So we had to make sure that the scope was meaningful to some extent, but at the same time looking at the core elements of the sector as well, right? So we focus on the oil and gas production in Malaysia in accordance to the OGMP 2.0 guidelines, because when we want to come up with the analysis, what we looked at is how we can synchronize the reporting according to that guideline, and at the same time look at the data from there. So, and to define that even further, we looked at the oil system and the gas system, particularly looking at the production for both cases over here, right? So if you're wondering about what happened to exploration and so on, of course, that it's not covered under our scope at this stage of our project. Of course, if there is a need for us to dive deeper into those areas, then of course, I think that'll be something that maybe Swinburne and EDF can have a further discussion later on as well. But at least this is the scope and direction of our work here. And that brings us to the aim and objectives for our project. So the aim for us here is to evaluate the marginal abatement cost for each potential emissions abatement technology. And we break that down into two objectives. So the first objective here is that we want to determine the methane emissions for upstream production segment in the oil and gas sector in Malaysia, right? So this data is not easily available. So it's not accessible through publications. There's no reports available at this point of time, but at least we need to define a baseline of the emissions. So this is what our project is looking at as the first objective. Another objective is eventually, once we have this information, how we can estimate the marginal abatement costs, and then eventually develop the MAC curve in short for that point. So these are the two deliverables of our project. And our project is broken down to three general phases here. So our first phase, when we started the project, we looked at determining the methane emissions for the sector in the oil and gas industry in Malaysia. And this involved looking at understanding the oil and gas sector, who owns the information. This is something that is very critical from the Malaysian context, because I think unlike other regions of the world, it probably who owns the data could be very different in terms of that perspective. So that is something that we had to understand, because ideally we would think that all operators have the information and we just have to deal with them. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case in Malaysia. There was a central point, a custodian of data, and we have to go through them to discuss and get that information. But not to worry, we will talk about this in more detail in the later part of the presentation. And then we also had to collect information and data that is existing in publication and any reports in open access. This is also to just crunch the numbers and see whether we have up-to-date information as well. And at the same time, we have to process any of the information, see whether there any information that we have contradicts each other, and then look to iron that out as well. So this is what we did in the first phase. And this first phase gave us an indication of the gaps of data. Essentially looking at what information that is existing and what is not existing or not easily accessible at this stage. Yeah. And then the second phase is where we, based on the data and available or whatever that is not accessible, we had to come up with reasonable ways to estimate those the emissions for methane. And of course, I will allude more to this in the coming slides. But essentially, we estimated the methane emissions in the sector. And then based on that, we look at the different technologies that are available. We benchmark it with different regions of the world. And we also contacted service providers that offer those services in terms of abatement technologies. We do understand that not all service providers in Malaysia can offer this abatement technology. So this is where it becomes very tricky because we might start picking up cost data that is not locally available, but we can't help it when there's nobody that can offer that service, so that's where we had to make sure we understand that aspect. And then later on we develop a model to help us calculate and do the estimations for the MAC curve and eventually come up with a preliminary MAC curve. And what we did with that was, once we had the MAC curve available, we organized two stakeholder engagements with industry stakeholders, with service providers, with ministry, with the government officials. And what we did was, during the stakeholder engagements, we shared this preliminary MAC curve, and we tried to get the feedback and opinions from people on the ground. Because for some reason, when you contact them through email, they're a bit coy and cautious about replying us, especially when it comes to emissions. It seems to be a very negative connotation. It's like we're trying to catch them, and say, please tell me your emissions, and yeah, so at least coming through a stakeholder engagement, it sort of helped ease the communication a little bit, because we had to spend a lot of time, and my team, we had to spend a lot of time figuring out what's the best way to sort of facilitate the discussion, so that we don't make it look like we are the auditors of your work, of your operations, Yeah, so that's essentially that. And we got a lot of interesting feedback, which we are going to share right now. And, hopefully that will give us some seeds of discussion anyway, later on. And once we got the feedback from the stakeholder engagements, phase 3 looked at how we could use that feedback to update our analysis. So we got some quantitative information, we got a lot of qualitative information. So we tried to see how we could use that information and that feedback to update our MAC curve analysis in that sense. Yep. And then we build some scenarios. And the reason why we have these scenarios is so that we can look at what is the uncertainty, the range of uncertainty in terms of the cost analysis that we put up, and also the emissions as well. Because we have an understanding of what the emissions are, but when we present this to the stakeholders, they give their feedback on how they feel about these numbers. This will give us at least some indication that how far are we too far away, and what can we do to improve that as well. And it's always good to start with something, and then when you bring it to the stakeholder engagement, and then the stakeholders will be able to give a better picture of what is happening on the ground. And of course, as I mentioned, we were able to study closely the uncertainties in the data for emissions, as well as the cost analysis later on as well, right? And a little bit more of our project methodology. Certainly, not all methodologies are foolproof, especially when it's very much dependent on data or accessibility of data. So one thing to declare here is the assumptions that we have taken on board when we were doing this work. One of the things is that, of course, I think the obvious one you may have picked up from the start of my presentation is that because some of this data is not easily accessible, we had to find the nearest data that is accessible in terms of publication. So of course, we had to base our analysis on 2022's data. All right, so that is something that we had to look into. Apart from that, the emission rates, this is something that one of our assumptions is that it's analogous to the US GHG inventory, as well as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management as well. And I'll explain further on this in my coming slides. Another assumption we took into account is that the capital cost and the O&M cost for this abatement technologies is assumed to be proportional to the equipment's capacity. So ideally, we would think that as more of this type of abatements go through the market, you will expect the cost to sort of like plateau a little bit, economies of scale, but we are assuming it to be stagnant for the time being at that given time. Of course, this is something that we can do a more advanced MAC curve or MAC analysis, given that we have that information, right? And next thing as well, we assume that this analysis is based on at least the expected operational time of the technologies. Apart from that, we looked in the analyzed cost, where we assume a 7% discount rate in order for us to do the calculations. So this is particularly a reason for this, which we will share later on as well, right? And let me just look at that. Yeah. So apart from that, we also did some analysis on, what would be the methane price that will allow us to sort of incentivize this abatement cost even further. In other words, that if you want to encourage more abatement, right, we want to tell stakeholders that, look, you stand to benefit more, from doing this abatement. Yes, some abatement probably brings in net revenue, but some do not. And then we wanted to see at which point of these prices, creates more revenue as well. So we did an analysis on that. So, we did the analysis based on this price, and we also did some sensitivity analysis as well. All right. And another major assumption that we made was we assume that the abatement options here in our MAC curve is not yet implemented in Malaysia. So we just assume the greenfield, assuming that these are all the emissions and none of this has been implemented yet. Because when we were talking about this MAC curve in stakeholder engagements, a lot of people are arguing, no, we've already done this. Why do I need to care about this now? And then, of course, we have to make sure that, when we declare the assumptions, it's clear. We are assuming that, you have a facility offshore or onshore, depending on the case, and it assumes that you have not done anything just yet. And this is the MAC curve analysis in that sense, right? Okay, and yeah, so just a quick overview of our data that we collected in terms of the oil and gas activity. So this is something that I've mentioned earlier. But on the other hand, what we also notice is the reporting of the emissions in the oil and gas industry in Malaysia. So we have two different publications that have reported on Malaysia's methane emissions. So the first one is, of course, the Malaysian government's biannual update report. So this, I think, should be number 4.0, if I remember correctly. Let me just double check later. I think it's the 4.01. So that is the latest one that went out, but these are the previous installments here. You can see in 2014, 16, and 19, emissions were reported. And this is interesting because these numbers vary quite a lot. And then when you compare with what IEA also estimated, and then you start to see a very stark difference in this case. So, we looked at this and we realized there is gaps in terms of the emissions being estimated over here. So one of the things we also looked at is we compared methodologies as well before we embarked on making the analysis. So what you can see here is that we have done a comparison between two methodologies. One, of course, is directly from IEA. They have their method of estimating the emissions. They use country scaling factors. So this is more like a tier 2 level estimation. And of course, this has some assumptions as well based on certain parameters or characteristics of a country. And this information is not accessible at the moment. So we can't really say how IEA did it in terms of the scaling factors yet. We have also engaged with them, but they said that the information is not ready for publication yet. So we are unable to get that information. Because one of the things that we wanted to do when we engaged IEA was we wanted to see whether the approach they took is something that we can adopt and do it for Malaysia as well. So as long as we understand how the scaling factors come about, especially the scaling factor for Malaysia, then we can see whether there's a way forward to use that. But unfortunately, since the information is not available at this point in time, so we couldn't go with that at that present time. But then we have the other method, which we see on our left-hand side over here, the IPCC method. So they focus on using emission factors. So IPCC use default values for the emission factors, and this is when you look at the tiers of estimations, this is sitting on tier 1. All right, it's more of a macro scale, top level estimation in that sense, right? And what we notice is that the Malaysian government is also reporting using the IPCC method. So we thought that, okay, as a form of a standardization, we could go with this for the time being and see whether we can get the necessary information to make things more accurate in that sense. But nevertheless, we still use both methodologies and we estimated the emissions using the both methodologies. And you will realize that these are the emissions over here. If you notice from the previous slide, I presented IEA's value. Maybe I'll just go back. It says 451. But now all of a sudden, Vic is saying it's 363. Did he make a typo in his presentation slides? No, not really. What we did was we adopted the method because we wanted to see how the method works. Plus, we knew some additional information about the oil and gas sector in Malaysia. The problem here is that in this report, it assumes that Malaysia has quite a lot of onshore production, which is not the case. All right, so that's why we had to just double check on that part. And of course, being in Malaysia, we have a clearer access to this information. And what we realized is only a very minute amount. I think it's on the grander scheme of things, it's almost negligible number of in terms of throughput for onshore production. A lot of it is offshore in Malaysia. A vast majority. So in that sense, when we tweak the numbers a little bit, you can see the numbers, change a little bit in that sense. So what we realized was maybe the Malaysian government using the IPCC method is overestimating the methane emissions for the oil and gas sector. So maybe we are over-reporting it. And this is where we thought this is a good opportunity for us in this project to look into this deeper and see how we can refine this analysis further. And that gives the direction of our work here. So in that sense, in terms of first, we had to classify our emissions by source. And then after that, we do the abatement cost analysis. So what we did is we looked at the OGMP 2.0's reporting guideline, and Petronas is also considering the following emission sources according to these categories over here by source. Yeah, so you can see a lot of familiarity in terms of the OGMP 2.0's reporting guidelines. Maybe some terminology is a bit slightly different, but nevertheless, at least the categories are more or less the same. All right, and we have to look at local methane emissions data by source. And of course, this was not accessible readily during the duration of the study. The project team has taken efforts, to speak to the custodian of the data locally We've had some discussions and engagements with them as well. But of course, this is an interesting process in the Malaysian context, because we have approached the operators, but the operators say that they are bounded by the custodian of this data, which is MPM in Malaysia. So we have engaged MPM to seek the data and get the information. And they requested that we get an endorsement from the ministry. So at this point of time, if I remember correctly, the ministry's name was Ministry of Natural Resources, Energy and Climate Change. And I'm saying this in a way because there was a change in the cabinet. There was a reshuffle in the cabinet. So the ministry broke into two. Yeah, very interesting story here. So it broke into two. So that also created some uncertainty of where this is under now. And when we approach again, and we still do, unfortunately, we're still waiting for that endorsement. So in the meantime, we've tried to find other ways around to get that data as well, and see how we can go about estimating that information from there. And so what we did was we made our estimations or distribution of emissions based on the US EPA, but we also looked at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management because the data here, or the distribution in a BOEM, what we found was it has the closest topology in terms of the oil and gas sector to Malaysia. So they had their analysis for a different region, but at least the topology was a little bit similar. I wouldn't say identical, but at least the closest in terms of for us to make those estimations. And this allowed us to distribute that even further to the emission sources as well. So you can see those percentages over here. And source-wise methane emissions, the estimates are over here. You can see this is largely dominated by venting and also not fugitive emissions, rather than fugitive. The next one would be the pneumatic pumps. And also we have stationary combustion as well as pneumatic controllers. And this is also sort of like aligning with our conversations during the stakeholder engagement. Of course, we first estimated this without any information from the stakeholders. And this whole distribution looked very different before our stakeholder engagement. So when the moment we went for the stakeholder engagement and then we got feedback from them, a lot of information on the ground was very valuable for us to sort of tweak this calculations and improve these calculations to sort of reflect what's happening on the ground in that sense. So now the one that we are showing you is the updated one, the one that we have over here. All right. Apart from that, we also had to look at the abatement options. So you will realize that a lot of these are very common and very similar from other reports, other analysis. And what you can see over here is that we've also collected the information on their reduction capability, meaning the reduction of methane, also their capacity, as well as their capital costs and their O&M costs. Just to let you know, some of these costs were updated based on our service provider information that we got locally. So you will realize some of these values are very much different from what's estimated in other parts of the world. Yeah, so you could see, because when you have something that is local, probably the prices tend to differ, sometimes even cheaper. Yeah, especially with the workmanship cost and everything like that, you significantly reduce the cost from there. But some, of course, we don't have service providers that offer that service. That's when we have to use references from other published data, or maybe even other service providers as well, or outside of the country. All right, and apart from that, the characteristics data, we got it from the EPA's natural gas STAR program as well. Yeah, so that's that. And yep, so apart from that, these are just matching some of the emission sources to the abatement options. So these are just some of the matches that we did. So I think this is not, we are not reinventing the wheel in a way. So these are all quite commonly established, but essentially from our analysis over here, this is the reduction potential that we have, and also the marginal abatement cost from our analysis here. So of course, these are information that we've shared through our slides over here. But essentially, I think the key point is to look at the MAC curve as well. But before that, as mentioned earlier, we did stakeholder engagements. Let me go deeper into how we went about these engagements. So as mentioned, Malaysia is divided into West Malaysia and East Malaysia. All right, so this part over here is where we are in the state of Sarawak, right at the bottom here in Kuching. So we did our first engagement in Sarawak. where we invited service providers, operators in the region, this region over here, and also ministry officials, government officials to come in, for our stakeholder engagement. So most of our attendees here in this engagement were from the state of Sarawak. So we also have north of Borneo, which is Sabah, the state of Sabah. Unfortunately, we couldn't secure anybody from there. So I want to just make this very clear so that everybody's aware that we didn't get much input from there because they were not available to join the event that day. So we could not follow up with them on that part. And then meanwhile, on the second engagement, we went to West Malaysia, where we had our second engagement at the Academy of Sciences Malaysia office in Kuala Lumpur. And this is where we had engagements with stakeholders from this region of Malaysia, the west side of Malaysia. So we're talking about, again, similarly, service providers, ministry officials, and also operators who are operating facilities in that region as well. Yeah. And this is just some images of where of our stakeholder engagement. So this is the one in our university. So you can see over here. So a lot of we had a balance of people who are from operators, from government officials, and also we didn't have service providers in East Malaysia. So mostly it's operators. So operators and government officials, right? On the other hand, in the second stakeholder engagement, this was a bigger event because we had a lot more attendees. And I think the reason being is that a lot of service providers, they have their office base in Kuala Lumpur, in the state, I mean, in the country's capital. And I think they have to be within the radius of Petronas main office because of easy access and whatever not. So that's why you have a bigger attendance over there. So here we have a lot of operators, service providers. We even had think tank researchers as well. So a lot of research institutes, government research institutes, non-governmental research institutes that have sent their researchers to come and have a look at our presentation, look at what our findings are. In fact, I understand EDF is now working together with a research institute in Malaysia as well, the International Strategic, I think it's ISIS in short, but let's not get that too confused. It's not the terrorist group that we're talking about in there. The full term sometimes escapes me a little bit, but yeah, it's an Institute of Strategic International Studies, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so EDF is working with that organization to develop further methane-related studies in other parts or other sectors in that sense. And I think they're focusing on the impact on jobs, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so they came over for this stakeholder engagement as well to gain some insights on how far we have come on our journey. And at the same time, we were able to share some of our, challenges and also achievements throughout the project. And at the same time, it was very interesting because we broke them into focus groups, as you can see over here, having discussions, getting their feedback. And we also tailored some questions so that, based on the attendance. So we had one group or one a table that focused on attendees who are from government ministries, from think tanks, from maybe research institutes, while the other table was operators and service providers and so on. So the questions we had to tailor according to the table so that we can get different insights accordingly from there. So it was a very interesting experience, and very interesting insights were gathered here as well. And one of the things I was thinking when I was thinking about the content of this presentation today was I wanted to show a little bit also about what we got in terms of perspectives from Malaysia, the insights that we got, particularly from this stakeholder engagement. For instance, some of the sources of methane emissions, we can say that it's predominantly from the oil system, not so much on the gas system, looking at the production as well. And what we also notice on the ground is that many assets have phased out venting, but still engage in to some extent a continuous venting in some parts in that sense. All right, but of course, Petronas has already mandated such operators to cease the continuous venting. So this is it's very good to hear this kind of information because it creates a qualitative connection to the numbers that we are putting out, and it helps us to make some informed decisions on whether do we trust the numbers that we put out or do we have to make some changes according to that. And another important insight that we got from the engagement is that a lot of the facilities are now moving towards a zero routine flaring. and also to minimize unplanned flaring. So if we don't speak to this the stakeholders during the engagements, we will not be able to get this information right here. Yeah, and methane emissions distribution. So right now, what we have done as a baseline estimation is that we have estimated based on the productivity level. So of course, this is based on IPCC's method. IPCC's method of estimation is using the oil and gas production activity data, and based on that, there's factors to estimate the emissions. But of course, in terms of the distribution, we are taking into account 85% comes from incomplete flaring and venting, about 9%, not so much 10, is from gas engines and turbines, and about 5% is from fugitive emissions. And this is the information we get from the stakeholder engagements. So we had different numbers before this. All right. So before the engagements, we had different numbers. And when we went in, we realized, oh, okay, this is interesting. We started to look at how we can tailor according to the feedback that we got from there. And another interesting insight is that a lot of the methane abatement strategies that we are presenting here, or that we're considering here, have already been implemented in some of these facilities or assets, but they never looked at it from a methane reduction measures point of view. They just looked at it, it's addressing safety concerns. So now it's because reporting is going to become a major component of moving forward. I think it's about time we start looking at it from a methane's emission reduction point of view. Yeah. So this is something that was a very interesting nuanced information that we got from here. Apart from that, we also got some interesting information that whatever estimates that we initially provided, overall estimates of methane emissions in the sector, what we realized, we were like more or less 25% higher than the estimated. I mean, the emissions that are actually happening in Malaysia is 25% higher than the estimated value. The reliability of this information is something that I can't really say at this stage, but at least this is what the information we collected from the stakeholder engagements. We got this from operators in the industry. They said that the emissions that we are pointing at, presenting at that point in the engagement, is 25% lower than what is the reality. So we used that information and we brought it back to see how we can update our estimations in that sense. Apart from that, methane abatement is largely effective operational controls rather than deployment of specialized technology. So this is also another point. And when you look at existing emissions estimation methodology, so this is the thing that I alluded to earlier. Most of it is predominantly offshore nature. But if you look at the previous estimations, like from IEA and from IPCC, they assume there is an equivalent amount of onshore production, which is not really the topology in Malaysia at the present time. And that is also another thing that we got from the stakeholder engagements. There was some feedback from there as well, right? Because we had asked some questions. Do you agree with this? Do you not agree with our approach to this? And a lot of them say yes, it's a fair way of going about it in that regard. Apart from that, there are some challenges as well that was highlighted. And I think this is something that I had a discussion with Huang just before we started the session today. A lot of interesting feedback on securing capital for undertaking abatement projects in Malaysia. So a lot of the stakeholders mentioned in the engagement, they say that a lot of challenges are there in terms of funding. On when we talk about priority, what is the level of priority and urgency in doing methane abatement in Malaysia, especially in the oil and gas sector? One of the things that we see that in West Malaysia, there's a high urgency, there's a very high level of awareness as compared to East Malaysia. But the issue is whether is there a push from other parts of the value chain. For instance, is there any capital accessible, for stakeholders or operators to really look into doing this going forward? What we notice is that a lot of the ministry's directions and emphasis right now is more towards renewable energy transition projects, initiatives, and so on. So the focus or the direction doesn't really go towards methane abatement in the oil and gas sector per se. So this is a bit interesting, because when we want to look at analysis of cost, we must understand that this has an impact on that later on as well. If there is any changes in the way the government or the ministry looks at this problem and makes funding accessible, the cost curve can change accordingly. In that regard, the shape may look differently as well. And this is a good segue to the level of awareness as well. So when we compare to stakeholders in West Malaysia and East Malaysia, we realized that it differed, and the level of understanding or in terms of emphasis on the topic is rather different. We see participants from West Malaysia show greater urgency in the topic, while East Malaysia, represented only by the state of Sarawak, we see it's more like a rather wait and see approach. They are very cautious about how they view this topic in that regard. So that gave us a qualitative understanding of how they look at the topic, how they perceive the analysis, as well as moving forward, how things are going to develop in that regions as well. All right, so now going to the gist of the whole presentation here. And this is our marginal abatement cost curve to date. So we did have some additional information that I think this was probably the slide deck was probably shared with the audience. I think maybe Huang can confirm this. So yeah, there was some initial estimates that we shared, but we were able to update it based on recent data as well. We were able to expand our uncertainty analysis even further. We just recently got some additional information. So what we did was we wanted to see, we didn't want to present with a narrow uncertainty range. We wanted to do it a bit bigger because we had some recent development in information as well, which I will mention in the next slide. But looking at the curve here, we realized that by deploying all the considered options, about 93% of emissions reduction can be achieved within this cost. So this is about a 2.4 to 3 million USD, right? And the global methane pledge target is about 30% reduction by 2020. This should be, I think, by 2030, if I remember correctly, not 2033. So sorry for the typo. Yeah, and but then by doing this, the net revenue here should be approximately 5.5 to 9.6 million. So there is that range because of our engagement with the stakeholders as well. And net revenue meaning that after investing in this, you get a net revenue of this value over here, right? And if you want to go up to 60%, then of course the net revenue, this is probably going further from the emissions here. So 60% is somewhere approximately around this region here. So the net revenue would be approximately within this range here. Yeah, so we also did a break-even analysis here. To achieve positive outcome under 95% methane reduction, the gas price needs to be at this value. So this will allow almost 95% reduction in terms of methane emissions. But of course, if it's less than this, I think 95% probably not. You won't be getting a net revenue from there at this stage. So this is just some analysis that we did. But now to the point of why we had to update the analysis for today's presentation was because we got additional feedback from stakeholders saying that the emissions distribution for flaring, venting, and pneumatics are between 80% to 90% of the distribution. If you remember earlier, what we did was we used 85%. So that's like a nice sweet spot in the middle. But then looking at the fact that it could be between 80 and 90, so we had to update and look at the analysis and come up with a much bigger range if necessary to quote the uncertainty behind here. So this serves as a basis for further uncertainty analysis in the study over here. So essentially we had to update that in that sense. So just to share with you some recent information that we received. So we did the base case and then we looked at the case 1, case 2, and then the case 1 was when it's the lowest value in terms of distribution of venting, flaring, and pneumatics emissions. And then case 2 is about 90%. So what we actually change here is essentially the stationary combustion. Our assumption here is that we are keeping the fugitive emissions at the highest value in that sense, right? So this is what we get in terms of reduction as well as the abatement costs as well. So we see high distribution in flaring in case 2, so it poses better cost effectiveness. Of course, when you have less distribution of the majority, I think in that sense we would see a much lower cost in that sense. But certainly this is due to the lower annualized capex and of course greater gas credit gain from the leading to negative marginal cost. Negative marginal cost here refers to net profit in that sense, right? And then of course, apart from that, what we also did was we did an additional 25% of the overall emissions. Remember, from the stakeholder engagements, we got information from our stakeholders saying that the total emissions that we estimated is 25% lower. So we took that into account and we updated our analysis to also look at, how we can incorporate that into our range of uncertainty. So, and there you go, this is captured in that sense as well. And you can see the greater baseline emissions poses greater driving force to mitigate methane, as more potential savings can be met. However, the higher costs needed to achieve reduction of more than 60% is certainly there compared to the lower baseline emissions that we see over here. So that means certainly in order to get 60%, you probably need higher costs to be invested before you can achieve that target there. All right, but of course, in every analysis and in every study, there are limitations, and certainly there are some challenges that are faced. So I thought I'll also share our perspective from our team. What are the limitations that that we experience, as well as also the challenges that we had to undergo and overcome as well. So one of the key areas of our study is that the methane emissions, they are estimated values instead of direct measurements. So there is varying degree of maturity in terms of direct measurements in Malaysia. So we do see a lot of service providers coming up now slowly, offering their services in direct measurement. Some, for example, just from metering to drone measurements and so on. So a lot of interesting conversations we had during the stakeholder engagements as well. So we had people who are service providers who look into drone measurements as well. And we also had some from other parts of the value chain as well, who gave their insights. Apart from that, the emissions distribution, as I mentioned earlier, it's based on US EPA inventory, as well as the BOEM's topology assessments there. Apart from that, we also have cost data, which we basically majority is from literature. So from past reports, published reports, and so on, with a minor amount from service providers in Malaysia who were ready to let us know what the cost values would be. And unfortunately, even some of the service providers that were able to provide the service didn't quite get back to us with that information. The reason being is that they're pressed for time. They have other projects to complete, so they were not able to spend time with us. And despite us also extending the invitation for the stakeholder engagement, unfortunately, we were not able to come and contribute to the engagement as well. That's okay. Next. The abatement potential as well is a key point as well. So that is something that that we assume that is constant, but can be improved in the future if there is some advancement in that sense. Yeah. And some challenges as well. What we noticed was MPM requested an endorsement letter from the ministry, as I mentioned earlier. But of course, this requires time as well. There was also a non-disclosure agreement initiated between MPM and the project team, which we really pushed through to get through. But then, of course, without the endorsement, we were not able to, close this completely. But of course, our methodology is from the IPCC's methodology, but certainly it can be updated with once the right data comes into the picture as well. And we also got a lot of interesting inputs and insights, which we felt that, based on the data and the updates from there, we were able to improve the estimations, hopefully get closer to the more refined values, essentially, which is the aim of our project, to come up with more refined estimations from what is being presented in the past. So with that, thank you very much. I think I took up quite a lot of time, but hopefully that was a sufficient insight for everyone. We are looking forward to your questions, but if you'd like to get in touch with the Swinburne team, you're more than welcome to scan this QR code over here. The QR code leads to all our LinkedIn profiles, and you're more than welcome to get in touch with us. If you'd like to collaborate, you have some inputs you'd like to share, or if you have any questions, or if you are trying to implement something in your respective regions, and you would like to hear how, what kind of problems we face, we're more than happy to, share those, and you can see whether we have similar, experiences as well.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your excellent presentation. I really like to hear about the nuance that you get from the stakeholder engagement sessions that you have, because a lot of the things that we probably would never get if we just don't come to the country to do all this interaction as well. I do see this not really a question, but an offer to get in touch with you from Alexandra at the IEA. Alexander, would you like to say something? I see that you're still online.
Hi, yeah. Just briefly, we're always happy to accept more data, so would be very happy to get in touch about what you mentioned regarding onshore versus offshore production in Malaysia. And thank you as well for the excellent presentation. Very interesting.
Sure, no problem. Happy to get in touch. I think what I will do is probably, I think I have access to the email, to the chat over here. Maybe I can put my email in the chat so that we can get in touch through email as well. And I would like to also invite my team members, Prashant, Dr. Prashant, and also Miss Adeline to also put your emails there as well. I'll also put my colleague, Dr. Howe's email here. He will be joining us. Oh, I'm not sure whether he's already in. Oh, he's not. Okay, so he's still having his class. So he's still doing his lecture right now at the university. So he said he'll join us a bit later when he has the time. Yeah, so I'm just putting that in the chat.
That's good. Yeah.
Is
Great.
only
Thank you
going
so
to
much.
the. Is this only going to the panelists?
No, it's going to the chat, I believe.
All right. Maybe.
Oh,
Okay.
I can put it up to everyone, so I can copy and paste and send it to everyone. Just want to offer the chance to other folks who have some questions to Vignesh. Ken, can I?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for the outstanding presentation. You know, in when we do cost analysis for abatement, there's a kind of a top-down approach that economists use, general equilibrium modeling, that kind of thing, and then bottom up. And one of the conflicts is always the economists comment to the engineers, if there's really an opportunity to reduce emissions at negative cost, why isn't it happening already? That is, are you saying that the people managing the processes don't understand? There are other barriers. What and so I, you know, given that a significant portion of your marginal abatement cost curve is below $0 per ton, I'm wondering, why isn't that happening already?
All right. Thanks, Kenneth, for the question. Interesting question. So, as mentioned in my presentation, we assume that these are not being implemented, but there are varying degrees of this abatement already being implemented. So, we could say that these are already being taken up, but the nuance from the stakeholder engagement was they don't see it as a methane abatement option. They just see it as, they're addressing a problem of generally leakages or, safety concerns, because methane is combustible, in that sense, right? So they have implemented detections, they've implemented repairs and this kind of thing. So a vast majority of the front, at least, of our MEC curve are things that there are varying degrees of implementation already. Yeah, so it's just that our MEC curve is just to say that assuming that you have not done anything and you want to know the cost, this is how it looks like. But the issue is that this is not being translated clearly. I think that's where I agree with your question in a way. They don't understand the significance of what they're doing. Yeah, they don't understand it from a revenue standpoint. Hey, what you're doing is actually beneficial to you. You're actually getting a net positive out of this thing. But and that's where that stakeholder engagements was a very big eye opener, not just for the project team, but also those who are in the engagement as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much.
No problem. I think we have a question from Ruth.
Thank you. A very nice presentation. Thank you so much. I have a brief comment related to this last point, and that is, which is something which is very often underestimated by researchers and analysts. That is the return on investment requirements of oil and gas companies. Yeah, this is often for specific projects, double-digit percentages. It can be 40–50% if you look at somewhat risky investment. So the 7% that IA uses 10%, you've used 7%. This is from a social society perspective already relatively high, but for oil and gas companies it's low. So especially investments that are going to need multiple years to earn a return, the 7% is not going to cut it. And if you go to something like 30-40% per year, because that is the return on investment of the investment alternative opportunities, many of the net cost options that we seem to have are for the companies not net cost options anymore.
Yep, understood. Yeah, there is a reason why we looked at 7%. I think, Prashant, you're in the, I think you should be there. I think, Prashant, just to double confirm, I think just want to clarify with you, the reason why we took 7% is because we wanted to make it consistent with the international reports. I think some reports have used 7% in the past, but Prashant, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen some references of 7%. So yeah, so that's why we took.
So it's more like just for us to compare apple with apple. It's not so much to prescribe that 7% is the way to go forward. I do agree with Run in that sense. Yeah, I mean, certainly it's very much dependent on the context of the situation on the ground. But at least for us, the way we approached this was more towards, if we want to compare apple and apple, we want to look at least all these other parameters, assuming that they are the same. And then, we get additional new data or on the ground information, how this changes things. And that creates a better conversation to go forward on improving the analysis further. Yeah.
I'm not criticizing your study. I think you've done a great job.
No.
It's more a general threshold that governments need to be aware of.
Yep, understood. Good point though. Thanks. No, I think you're muted.
Any other question?
Yeah.
I'm curious, Vignesh. So after this marginal cost analysis, did you manage to compare what you have calculated with what the IEA have for the marginal cost curve for Malaysia?
Yes. So in terms of, at least in terms of emissions, because everything else is based on the emissions. So what we realized was the general observation we have was the emissions are much, there is a lower value. I think the one that IEA estimated was, at least the report that we got access to, was about 450 kilotons. That was back in 2022, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so on that point, at least from our estimations, and it's 2022, so it's 451. But we were in the range of 350 kilotons in terms of emissions. So we do see a significant, a reduction. But this is particularly because we were able to refine the consideration that the topology is different in Malaysia in general. We don't have significant amount of onshore production, which does sway the calculations a bit more in that direction. Yeah.
That's an interesting one, because what we usually say is that the IEA, we all know that there's a huge uncertainty with IEA's data, but we usually say that it's an underestimated of what the actual methane emissions look like. But here you're using the one that is lower.
Yeah.
Of course, I know that you put the 25% uncertainty on top of it, but it is an interesting take. And I guess you mentioned that it's also something that you took from the stakeholder engagement.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I just have a question on one of I make a note here. You said the methane abatement is largely effective operational controls rather than the deployment of specialized technology for emissions reduction. Could you explain this insight a little bit?
Sorry, just give me a moment to go to that slide. This is going into the point that I mentioned, that a lot of times that a lot of this abatement options are implemented. This goes to the point where I mentioned, I responded to Kenneth earlier, where when they implement these options, they are implementing this with the idea of operational control and also from safety perspective. So it's not from the perspective of I'm specifically looking at methane's measurement and looking at reducing my methane because of, OGMP 2.0, obligations and so on. It's more like, yes, there is a leak from a safety standpoint. We need to do something about it. And there is a leak because we don't want our revenue to, to just go out just like that. So yeah, so it's from that perspective. So mainly it's an operational part. That's what I mean by operational part, meaning to say that it's more from the revenue point of view. We don't want to waste the revenue. And when it comes to safety, it's more like, combustible gases. So we don't want that to come out and create a risk factor for the facility. So that's generally the angle in which a lot of them are approaching the implementation. Yeah.
Now, my final question, unless anybody have any other question, do you think that there's going to be a scenario where the Malaysian government will put a price on methane emissions?
Ooh, loaded question. To be fair, this is just more of a personal opinion, at least based on what I'm seeing in the landscape here right now. I can also invite my team members here to say otherwise and disagree with me, but at least from my point of view, I think the Malaysian government is having different priorities at this stage. I think they are looking at, because they recently came up with the National Energy Transition Roadmap. And if you dig deeper into the roadmap, methane reduction is not really the main actor there. It's all about CO2. It's a lot about, decarbonizing, carbon capture. It's about hydrogen. It's about, renewable energy, biogas usage, and yeah, all this kind of stuff. So biofuels and so on. So you don't see methane reductions in oil and gas sector as a real thing and like a very significant, narrative there. So, and this is something that recently came out. So this roadmap was something that recently came out. So I perceive it as this are the priorities at the present time. So putting a price on just oil and gas and methane, not really. I think it will still require a bit more time for that. I think they're more concerned about how to decarbonize in terms of CO2 and focus on emissions related to CO2 instead, and transitioning to different operations altogether in that sense. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Kenneth, I see your hand raised, and I don't know if you have other question, but I would like you to share any insights that you have, because I know that you have been working on the carbon market project in Malaysia.
Yeah, thanks, Huang. I actually did have a question, but I'll comment on the first. So the Malaysian government is examining both the potential for a carbon pricing instrument and the potential for an offset system that would accompany that. One of the things that they are going to have to address is what is covered by the carbon pricing instrument.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what goes under the offset system. And in some cases, they might even be considering going ahead and putting a tax on something like CCS, and then adding the potential for getting offset credits if you actually do make the reductions. It would be an overlap. It would be an unusual approach, but in concept, it's feasible. But the real issue, and what I think your contribution here is demonstrating two points, perhaps. The first one is that even a relatively modest carbon tax would interest the potential methane emissions abaters because the cost here is relatively low. When you get into the positive costs, there's still quite a bit of reduction available at relatively low cost using the 7% discount rate. But the second thing that you demonstrate is that they're going to have to decide whether they would give offset credits for that portion of activities that already on paper have a positive return, or that is a negative cost. And I think Rudd's comment demonstrated how incredibly important it's going to be to express what a reasonable rate of return is, to get at, does this pass financial additionality? So I think that the results you have here are thought-provoking in many different ways. And so I want to thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
I did want to ask about the next slide after the marginal abatement cost, which is the uncertainty slides. And I'm having a little trouble interpreting that. And I wonder if you might help me. I'm probably just missing something. But it looks as if that under any of the three scenarios, that the cost, and I think that is total cost, actually goes down. And is that because of those negative costs associated with the left-hand side of the marginal abatement cost curve?
Okay, let me just share my screen so that everybody gets to see the slide as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm guessing you're referring to this one?
That one exactly.
Oh, okay.
And it's just that it's so unusual to see a curve that goes down as you do more of something, but I'm guessing that's related to your result that the left-hand side of your previous, your abatement costs is in a negative range.
Yes,
so your
that's right.
total costs go down. Okay, good. I just wanted to be sure I understood that. That's a really important result, and I think one of the reasons that it's important to work on the sensitivity analysis, and because that's quite a big deal if there's that much opportunity to reduce emissions at a negative cost.
Yeah, exactly. And just thanks for your reflections, Kenneth. If I may just stop sharing the screen. Just wanted to add on the point that you mentioned about the carbon part. Yes, I do agree that a lot of the focus here in Malaysia right now is more on carbon pricing. So just to give you some context, Bursa Malaysia is the it's the stock exchange operator in Malaysia, and what they do is they've recently started looking at voluntary carbon market schemes, and they've launched the Bursa Carbon Exchange, and that is still on a VCM approach, not a mandatory one at the present time. And the focus is on offsets and also on essentially a abatement for carbon dioxide in that sense. So you can see a lot of the shift is towards that direction. We are likely going to be looking at a new a study on VCM, but not on methane, because my project team, we also work on other sectors, the energy sector, as well as the palm oil industry here in Malaysia as well. So looking at how ready the palm oil industry is in achieving net zero emissions. So we did an initial study for the government agency over here to see how ready is the palm oil industry in achieving net zero emissions, looking at the technologies available and the practices in the industry. And then now the next study that we are hoping to get, hopefully fingers crossed, the proposal is accepted for funding, will be to look at the potential of this carbon market and the carbon pricing element on that analysis as well. So that is also another angle that we're looking at. So who knows, maybe this might also fall into methane in the future as well. Yeah, I just wanted to add on that as well.
Thanks very much again, and thanks, especially thanks to Vignesh for your excellent presentation and sharing with us your experience working on this project. So we actually 15 minutes over time. So hopefully that we can meet again for the next. Hopefully that the project will be extended, and then we will hope we will see each other again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody. Thanks Juan. Thanks for organizing this. Take care.
Take care.